They were introduced to you as heroes: David, Moses, Solomon, Paul, giants of faith, moral pillars, men chosen by God. But Gen Z reads the same stories and sees something very different. They don't see heroes. They see violence, power, control, silence around suffering. So here's the real question. Why does a generation raised on justice and accountability struggle to trust the Bible's most celebrated figures? Is it rebellion? Or is it something deeper? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it changes the way you read everything. The collision of values. Every generation inherits stories. They are passed down like heirlooms, polished by tradition, protected by reverence. But Gen Z inherited something else too, a moral vocabulary shaped by conversations about consent, equality, mental health, and trauma. They were taught to recognize power dynamics, to question systems, to listen to the marginalized voice in the room. Now place that lens over ancient texts. Moses commands wars in the name of God. Entire cities fall under divine instruction. David desires another man's wife, takes her, and arranges her husband's death on the battlefield. Solomon gathers wives and concubines in numbers that signal status more than love. Paul instructs women to remain silent in churches that would later preach spiritual equality. For centuries, these stories were framed as divine strategy, mysterious but righteous, uncomfortable but necessary. The moral weight was softened by phrases like God's plan or greater purpose. Doubt was seen as immaturity. Reverence was the default posture. But Gen Z was not raised to default to reverence. They were raised to ask who benefits and who pays the price. If a modern leader claimed divine permission for violence, we would demand investigation. If a celebrity used power to take another man's wife, we would call it exploitation. If a teacher told women to stay silent, it would spark outrage across social media within minutes. So when Gen Z reads the Bible, they are not trying to desecrate it. They are applying the same ethical standards they apply everywhere else. And that is where the collision happens. If this happened today, would we call it holy? Or would we call it abuse of power? The question is not sarcastic, it is sincere. It comes from a generation trained to protect the vulnerable and to distrust unchecked authority. They are not trying to erase the past. They are trying to reconcile it with the moral instincts they have been taught to trust. That tension does not dissolve with a quick sermon. It lingers in the mind. It presses against inherited faith. And the more seriously they take justice, the harder it becomes to ignore. The internet changed authority forever. There was a time when questioning a Bible hero meant questioning your entire community. Doubt was not just intellectual, it was social. To challenge David or Moses was to risk being labeled rebellious, prideful, even dangerous. Information flowed in one direction, from pulpit to pew, from elder to child. Authority was local, embodied, and largely unquestioned. Now imagine growing up in a world where every claim can be checked in seconds. A 17-year-old sits in church, hears a sermon about historical certainty, and quietly opens another tab. Within minutes, they are reading historians who disagree. They scroll through archaeological debates. They watch scholars argue about authorship and translation differences. They compare how the same verse reads across multiple Bible versions and notice subtle shifts in meaning. The monopoly on interpretation is gone. Authority is no longer sacred by default. It is searchable. It is reviewable. It is rated and debated in public view. A pastor's confident tone competes with a professor's lecture and a skeptic's breakdown video. For the first time in history, sacred texts exist in the same digital arena as every other idea. And that changes the psychology of belief. When previous generations encountered tension in Scripture, they often relied on trust in their spiritual leaders. Today, trust must survive exposure to competing explanations. When a Bible hero's story raises moral questions, Gen Z does not have to sit alone with discomfort. They can instantly find thousands of others asking the same thing. And once you realize that interpretations differ, that scholars disagree, that historical context is debated. Something subtle shifts. The aura of untouchable certainty begins to dim. The halo starts to flicker. But this is not simply about access to information. It is about the erosion of automatic deference. When every authority can be cross-examined, respect becomes conditional. Trust must be earned, not assumed. And if a story cannot withstand scrutiny, Gen Z does not quietly suppress the doubt. They follow it. Trauma awareness rewrites the story. Gen Z grew up hearing words previous generations rarely spoke out loud: gaslighting, narcissism, emotional manipulation, boundaries, trauma responses. These are not fringe concepts to them. They are everyday language, used in classrooms, therapy sessions, and social media conversations. They were trained to notice patterns of control, even subtle ones. Now, revisit certain biblical narratives through that lens. A God who hardens Pharaoh's heart, ensuring defiance, and then unleashes punishment for that defiance, a test that asks Abraham to raise a knife over his own son to prove loyalty. An eternal punishment described for those who do not believe correctly. These stories were once presented primarily as demonstrations of faith, obedience, and divine mystery. Older generations were taught to see devotion where there was fear, trust where there was surrender. The discomfort was reframed as reverence. Questioning the dynamic itself felt irreverent. But Gen Z does not instinctively separate morality from psychology. When they hear about hardened hearts and demanded sacrifice, they ask what it means to override someone's agency. When they hear about eternal consequences for disbelief, they question the emotional leverage embedded in the threat. If a human authority figure used fear of infinite punishment to secure loyalty, we would not call it love, we would call it coercion. This does not mean they hate faith or transcendence. It means they are hypersensitive to power used without consent. They are wary of systems where obedience is praised, but questioning is punished. They have been taught that healthy relationships do not require fear to maintain loyalty. So when trauma language enters theology, the categories shift. What was once framed as holy severity can begin to look like emotional pressure. What was once called submission can resemble loss of agency. The psychological dimension refuses to stay silent. And once that lens is applied, it is difficult to remove. The same story carries different emotional weight. The same command sounds different in a culture that prioritizes mental health and personal autonomy. Everything shifts, not because the text changed, but because the reader did. Heroes without consequences. Think about this carefully. In the modern world, when leaders fail morally, we demand accountability. If a politician lies, we want receipts. If a celebrity abuses power, we want consequences. If a CEO exploits people, we want resignation, lawsuits, public reckoning. Even when the punishment is imperfect, the expectation is clear. Power does not excuse wrongdoing. Now, bring that expectation into the Bible. Many of the most celebrated figures commit acts that, today, would end reputations instantly. David is not just flawed. He takes what is not his, then uses the machinery of power to eliminate the man in his way. Moses is not just a liberator. He is also connected to violence carried out under divine command. Solomon is praised for wisdom, yet his life is filled with excess, status, and domination. Even when the text acknowledges the sin, the hero status often remains intact. And then comes the phrase that hits Gen Z like a punchline. David is still called a man after God's own heart. Why? The traditional answer is grace. God forgives, God restores, God can use broken people. That message has comfort, especially for anyone who has ever felt unworthy. But Gen Z often hears a second message underneath it: selective forgiveness. The powerful fall and rise again, while the victims disappear into the background. The story lingers on the redemption arc of the hero, not the trauma of the harmed. The narrative energy goes toward restoring the leader, not repairing the damage. That creates a moral imbalance. Because in real life, systems that protect leaders while minimizing victims are exactly what people call corrupt. Gen Z has watched institutions cover for abusers. They have seen apologies without restitution. They have seen leaders granted second chances while ordinary people are discarded for less. So when Scripture seems to celebrate men who caused harm while offering little visible consequence, suspicion grows, not because Gen Z rejects forgiveness, but because they want it to be honest. They want repentance to look like transformation, not just divine approval stamped on a broken resume. And the question becomes unavoidable. Is redemption real, or is it reserved for the powerful? Moral progress creates moral distance. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Human morality evolves, not perfectly, not in a straight line, but undeniably. Practices once considered normal become unthinkable. Institutions once defended become condemned. Over centuries, we outlaw slavery. We expand women's rights. We criminalize marital rape. We redefine what counts as abuse. We sharpen our sensitivity to suffering. Now return to ancient laws and narratives. You encounter regulations about owning slaves, instructions about women as property, systems where conquest and forced marriage are woven into survival. Even when theologians carefully explain the historical context, even when they argue that certain rules were progressive for their time, the emotional distance remains. The modern reader does not feel morally aligned with those frameworks. Gen Z does not instinctively interpret this as gradual divine accommodation. They do not immediately see a long arc of moral revelation unfolding across centuries. What they see first is harm tolerated within sacred pages. They see practices that today would violate everything they have been taught about dignity and autonomy. And this creates friction. Because if morality improves over time, if societies grow more protective of the vulnerable, then why do divine heroes and divine laws appear morally behind us in certain areas? Why would an all-knowing source reflect norms that later generations would reject as unjust? If God is timeless, why does the text feel so anchored to its era? These are not shallow questions. They strike at the core of authority. They challenge the assumption that sacred equals superior in every moral dimension. Gen Z is not necessarily claiming moral perfection. They are simply comparing. They are measuring the distance between ancient commands and modern convictions. And that distance feels real. It does not disappear with a footnote. It does not dissolve with a reminder that times were different. It sits there, unresolved, creating cognitive tension between reverence and conscience. That question does not fade with age. It lingers in quiet moments. It returns during sermons. It whispers during personal reading. And the more seriously someone takes justice today, the harder it becomes to ignore. Authenticity over perfection. But here is the twist. Gen Z does not actually demand perfect heroes. They grew up watching public figures collapse in real time. They know everyone has flaws. They are not shocked by imperfection. What they demand is honesty about it. They resonate with flawed characters who admit failure, who confront their damage without excuses, who do not hide behind titles or divine endorsement. Vulnerability feels credible. Confession feels human. A hero who wrestles openly with guilt is more compelling than one preserved in stained glass. What they struggle with is sanitization. When sermons polish David into a clean role model, highlighting courage while softening cruelty, something feels off. When Bathsheba becomes a footnote and Uriah becomes a background character in David's redemption arc, the imbalance is obvious. The narrative energy goes toward restoring the king, not reckoning with the harm. The mess is acknowledged briefly, then quickly reframed as a lesson in forgiveness. It feels incomplete. And Gen Z can sense that incompleteness immediately. Not because they are cynical or eager to tear down tradition, but because they were raised in a world saturated with branding. They understand curated images. They have watched influencers crop out reality and institutions craft polished statements that avoid hard truths. They have developed an instinct for when a story is being managed rather than examined. So when sacred figures are presented without emotional weight, Without lingering on the consequences of their actions, it resembles public relations more than truth-seeking. The instinctive reaction is not rebellion. It is suspicion. They do not need their heroes to be spotless. They need them to be transparent. They want the tension left intact. They want sermons that sit in discomfort rather than rushing to resolution. They want to see that faith can survive unedited reality. Because authenticity builds trust. Perfection demands distance. And Gen Z is not looking for untouchable icons on pedestals. They are looking for something solid enough to wrestle with, something human enough to believe. The collapse of tribal loyalty. For much of history, religion functioned like a tribe. It gave you identity, belonging, protection. Your sacred stories were not just beliefs. They were your people. To defend Moses or David was to defend your grandparents, your neighbors, your own place in the world. Loyalty was emotional before it was intellectual. Questioning a hero felt like betrayal. But Gen Z grew up in a different environment. Their social world is not limited to one church, one town, one tradition. They scroll through timelines where Christians, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, and skeptics all speak at once. They join conversations across continents. They absorb perspectives that would have been inaccessible a generation ago. They mix cultures online without crossing a border. Suddenly, Moses is not the only lawgiver in the conversation. Jesus is not the only moral teacher quoted in a debate. Confucius appears next to Paul. The Buddha appears next to Solomon. Ancient myths and modern philosophies sit side by side in the same feed. Sacred narratives now compete in the same digital space. And when every tradition claims moral authority, none receive automatic immunity. Each story is placed on the same analytical table. Each hero is compared, questioned, dissected. The protective bubble of tribal loyalty thins out. Gen Z does not instinctively defend a figure simply because that figure belongs to their inherited tradition. They evaluate. They cross-reference. They ask whether the moral claims hold up when placed next to others. This does not necessarily mean they disrespect the Bible. It means they do not grant it exclusive exemption from critique. When Moses commands violence, they compare it to violence in other traditions. When Jesus teaches love, they compare it to similar teachings elsewhere. The uniqueness claim must compete in an open marketplace of ideas. And without the shield of tribal instinct, Bible heroes stand exposed in a broader arena. They are measured not only by internal standards, but by global ones. Evaluated like any other historical figure, without special protection. And once sacred figures lose automatic defense, everything about how they are perceived begins to shift. It's not rebellion, it's consistency. Here is the part many older generations misunderstand. Gen Z is not rejecting Bible heroes because they despise morality. In many cases, they take morality painfully seriously. They march for justice. They speak about equality. They call out hypocrisy, even when it costs them socially. What they are resisting is not ethics, it is double standards. If we condemn modern violence, then we must wrestle honestly with ancient violence. If we demand consent in every relationship today, then we must question stories where consent appears absent. If we expose corruption in political leaders, then we cannot ignore corruption in sacred ones simply because time has passed. That is not rebellion, it is intellectual consistency. Consistency, however, destabilizes systems built on automatic reverence. If every claim is examined by the same standard, sacred status no longer shields uncomfortable details. Reverence becomes conditional on coherence. And that feels dangerous to institutions that rely on unquestioned loyalty. But there is a deeper psychological layer beneath the surface debate. When heroes fall from untouchable status, something else rises in their place. Personal responsibility. If no figure is beyond scrutiny, then no figure can carry your moral burden for you. You cannot point to David or Moses or Paul and say morality is settled because they were chosen. You must decide. You must weigh. You must confront the tension yourself. That shift is unsettling. It removes the comfort of outsourcing conscience to tradition. It forces the individual to think rather than inherit. It demands engagement instead of passive belief. For Gen Z, this is not an act of destruction. It is an attempt at coherence. They want their moral instincts and their inherited stories to align. When they refuse to ignore contradictions, they are not trying to burn everything down. They are trying to live without compartmentalizing their values. And once that process begins, it rarely reverses. Because consistency, once chosen, becomes a principle that reaches into every corner of belief. The real reason Gen Z doesn't trust Bible heroes isn't ignorance, it's exposure. Exposure to information that previous generations never had at their fingertips. Exposure to psychological frameworks that decode power and trauma. Exposure to competing worldviews that refuse to grant automatic supremacy to any single story. They are not automatically anti-faith. They are anti-unquestioned authority, and that distinction matters. Because once authority must explain itself, faith changes shape. It becomes less about inheritance and more about examination, less about defending heroes and more about understanding them. Maybe the point was never to idolize ancient figures. Maybe the point was to wrestle with them, to argue, to doubt, to think deeply enough that belief becomes chosen, not absorbed. Blind reverence creates dependence. Honest wrestling creates maturity. So the real question is not whether Gen Z will trust Bible heroes again. The question is whether faith can survive scrutiny, or whether scrutiny is the very fire that refines it. If you value truth over comfort, keep questioning. And if you want more conversations that challenge what we inherited, not just what we were told, subscribe.